Okay, I'm Damian, member of the Vue.js core team, and this will be about Vue.js 3.0, which is the upcoming version of Vue, the long-awaited version. And as already mentioned, I'm creating the news.vue.js.org website, which is the news platform, the official one. We also have a newsletter, which you can sign up, and also a podcast created by the amazing guys from Vue Mastery, Adam and Greg. So every story that we cover here can be also consumed on your on a tram if you want to listen to a podcast version of it. So I also do some open source work. I created 3 libraries. 2 of them became quite popular. Yeah, the pointer won't work here. One is the Vue multi-select library, which is kind of like a combo box multi-selection tool. Then there is Validate. This is a validation library, which is based on the state itself, not the input elements, which is something quite useful. And a few global events, which allows you to set up event listeners on the window object or the document, the same way you would do with components. This is as a component, so you can add the listeners and remove them by doing a very simple v-if. And since recently, I joined the CourseDoc startup, and we are building management system and scheduler for US-based universities. So, Vue.js. Just a quick question: who is using Vue.js here? Wow. I mean, probably everyone else just left. So that could explain. Okay, that's very good, very nice representation. So first, let's start with the overall direction for the changes. And there were already at least 2 talks on Vue 3. 2 of them happened at the VueConf US 2 months ago. One was by Chris Fritz and the other one was by Evan Yu. And Chris Fritz had this very fancy image, which you might recognize as related to Daft Punk, which was supposed to describe how Vue 3 will look like, as in the direction, which is harder, better, faster, stronger. And honestly, I don't really know what harder and stronger means in the context of JavaScript frameworks. But I do think Vue 3 will be better and faster compared to what we have right now, as in much better, much faster. So the focus that we are following, that we are having with the new version, is mostly on simplicity and explicitly, which means we want to unify the API, we want to make things more explicit, which should help with developing bigger applications and also help newcomers understanding what is happening. Then there is the flexibility, extendability, many abilities, which is about basically being more flexible in the way you can create components, and not only components, and also extendability, which I will be coming back to in a moment, and also removing quirks, which is some traps for beginners, which once you know them, you can work around them, but before that, there's usually some hitting on the wall, why isn't it working? Because there are some quirks right now. So that's for the direction. Now let's get through some of the changes. So you have to know that the next version of Vue is being written from scratch. Everything was thrown away, yeah, and then written from the very beginning with a completely new architecture, which takes all the functionalities that we had right now and puts them into separate packages as a monorepo. And because of that, it should improve the way the maintainability of the framework itself, and also make it easier for new people to contribute to the project, because now that we have everything is decoupled, and the responsibilities of the modules are very clear, it should be much easier to just like help out with the observer or maybe work on the renderer. So that was the biggest reason for that. And now the extendability, because of those changes. For example, we have like a base renderer and a web renderer, which is for the browser. But then there are projects like NativeScript and Wix, which are all both alternatives to solutions like React Native. And right now, they are already working. Like if you want to create mobile applications, native mobile applications with Vue, you can do that. But those projects have to kind of fork Vue and introduce their own changes, which is mostly the custom renderer. So it doesn't render into HTML elements, but native elements. And with the changes to the architecture, it should be much easier for them to keep up to date with the changes, like fixes with Vue, because they would only have to maintain, or mostly only, the renderer, the custom renderer for the platform that they want to target. And maybe someone will come up with a different reactivity engine to replace the one built in with Vue, because this is also being kind of extracted. Also, some more changes to the global API. So, most of the things like built-in components, like who of you knows Keep Alive component? Oh, there is one person. Okay, I see 2 people at least. So, if you don't use those components like Keep Alive, transition, or some other directives like vshow, like you never use vshow, and maybe methods like nextTick, they will be all tree shaken away from your bundle. So, and it doesn't involve any work on your end, except for using a bundler like Webpack or Rollup. But if you are using Vue CLI, you are already using a bundler. So this allows us to remove some of the pieces of the framework that you don't really need because you haven't used them. And this gets us to the size decrease, where the new core, the runtime, should be around 10 giga, that would be quite big. Kilobits zipped, where currently it's around 20. So this is like everything you will need to run Vue in your browser. Which is kind of cool because we are adding more features, but the size is decreasing, which is kind of amazing. So one of the more controversial changes that we are planning to introduce is native support for classes, JavaScript classes, which is a new thing. Right now you can do it if you use the Vue class component library, but the library has to go quite a long way to like work around some of the limitations, the current limitations, to provide a class API. So we think that with the new class syntax, you will be able to replace the library and use the classes the way you want to, because with classes, the IDE support should be a bit better when it comes to like type inference and so on and so on. So this is how the current syntax looks like for a component, and you can take a look how it changes when we are using classes. I will repeat it a few times. So the data is just becoming a property as a variable in the class. The component declaration is a static property. Then we have computed properties, just become a getter. And both methods and lifecycle hooks are basically functions inside the class. And that are the changes. Although if you don't like classes, don't worry. Like this syntax is completely optional. So you don't have to use it, and there are like no plans on removing the object-based syntax, so you're safe. Also, another question, who is using TypeScript here? Also a pretty large representation. Well, that's good because Vue 3 is being written from scratch with TypeScript. which I guess you can get better when it comes to TypeScript support when you write something in TypeScript. So all the typing, interfaces, everything should work very, very nice. And of course, you will be able to use decorators and the the TypeScript class syntax with the new Vue support for classes. And also the decision to use TypeScript for basically building Vue lies in the fact that as maintainers, we have a bit more information on what is happening, like what kind of like type of data we are expecting. So it also should improve the way and make it easier for people to contribute to the code, even though they will have to learn TypeScript. But that's not a bad thing, after all. Also, just keep in mind that this doesn't affect you in any way, because in the end, it also gets compiled to JavaScript or transpiled to JavaScript. So you don't have to use TypeScript in your application, and that's it. Although, even if you don't use TypeScript for building your app, some of the editors, like Visual Studio Code, can still give you hints based on this TypeScript types definitions for Vue itself. So you still get some benefits out of it. And next thing, new reactivity tracking engine. So before we go into the new one, let's do a very quick summary on how the current one works right now. So it's based on getters and setters created by object-defined property. And it works like this. So whatever we return from the data function, in this case, it's first name, my name, my last name, as in Damian Dulisz. Yeah. And then we are doing a transformation on top of the object, which goes through all the keys and adds a set of getters and setters, and getter and setter to each of those properties. And because of that, we are able to intercept what is happening. So whenever something tries to get the value or modify it, it goes through the getter and the setter. Yeah, and because of that, in our template, we are only displaying the first name. Only the first name is actually being used and registered as a dependency of the component, as in the render function, as the template. So whenever first name changes, the Vue component will know that it has to re-render the template, but we can modify the last name, and this won't trigger any re-renders, anything, which is kind of cool, and that's why we don't need those should component update hooks, lifecycle hooks, and so on. But there are some limitations when it comes to getters and setters. So who's familiar with those utility? Not that many of you. So the rest who is using Vue and doesn't know this, yeah, that's kind of on us, because you should know them, because if you don't use them, there might be a big chance that something in your code might break, because because the transformation happens at the beginning when we are getting the information and starting the component. If you try to, for example, add a new property to an object, it wasn't present when the transformation happened, and it's not observable, as in it's not being reactive. So to counter this, you have to use the Vue set method, where you pass your object, you pass the name of the property that you want to create, and then the value of it, so that you let Vue know that you are creating a new reactive property on an object, which is kind of a bummer. And the same happens to arrays when you want to set a value for a selected index somewhere in a position in the array. And the same goes to removing properties. But this is something that we want to fix with the new version, and we couldn't fix it sooner because of browser limitations. But the new version of the reactivity engine will be powered by proxies, which is a kind of new browser API, very powerful. And this allows us also to make or observe other data structures, like, for example, maps or sets. And then with the new reactivity engine, all those problems with keeping track of like new properties are gone. So you can add new, you can change elements in an array just like you would normally. The same with adding new keys to an object. Like everything works. No need to worry about any this isn't updating. Why is it updating, right? And there is a small note, small drawback, which is proxies can be polyfied for Internet Explorer 11 and below. So if you have to support this browser, there will be a compat version of Vue, which will be still using the old reactivity engine, so that it will be working in older browsers. But if you don't worry about Internet Explorer 11, then it's you can use the new one and basically don't struggle with the limitations of getters and setters. Also, there are some new quality of life changes. I won't be going very deep into it because I assume there won't be that many Vue people here. So that's also on me. So one of the requested functionality is being able to have multiple root nodes or fragments in React. Who's using React here? Okay, cool. So this will be possible right now, as in with the new version. This is already possible if you use render functions, but it's kind of, it requires a more low-level knowledge of the framework. And there also, we also have something like vModel, which is kind of like a two-way binding, but up until now, you only were able to set up a vModel on for just one property, which is only value. You could change the name, but you only were limited to one of those vModels. And if you would like to have like two-way data binding for other props, you had to use the .sync modifier, which is kind of the same as vModel, but a different API. So we decided to merge those two together. So as you can see on the right example, you can have vModels for multiple props, and it will follow a very straightforward way to update them by just emitting update : name of the property. And there are some performance improvements that are coming with the whole rewrite. And Evan, I think that was 3 months ago in Amsterdam, said double the speed, half the memory usage. And this is largely coming from the usage of proxies, because with proxies, with getter and setters, if you had like 1,000 objects, we had to go through, as in the framework had to go through all of those objects and set up getters and setters on all of those properties. Whereas with proxies, we just return a proxied version of the object, as in an object with proxies. And a proxy contains traps, which allow us to intercept all the access requests to as in attempts to get the data or change the data, so we can put our dependency tracking inside those traps, and it allows us to basically reduce a lot of computation before the component is ready and before the data is being observed. So if you look at the comparison for rendering 3,000 stateful components, you would see that the memory usage is less than half, and also less than half time spent on scripting, which is kind of nice. I mean, I'm not very much into benchmarking, but we are just comparing with our own framework, so it should provide a very, very nice performance increase overall. So those were the okay changes, but there are some very fancy changes that I'm very excited about. And quick question, who does know Mobix? Okay, probably more the React people. Okay, so Mobix, up until the version 4, I think, was also using object-defined property and getters, setters to basically the reactivity system was very similar to what Vue has been running. Right now it's also using proxies, I think, in the 5th version. So in the Vue 2.6, we also received in Vue Vue.observable, and the observable name might be kind of misleading as in RxJS. It's not an RxJS observable, so the name might be a bit weird. And it allows you to create standalone reactive objects outside of components. Because before that, the whole reactivity engine has been considered a private API, so you weren't able to access it directly. So for example, you had to create new Vue instances. For example, Vuex is creating a Vue instance underneath to have the to implement like a state management tool. So, what we get is advanced reactivity API, which allows us to create, observe, and react to changes to reactive objects outside of Vue components, like anywhere where we want it. It can be imported from the new package, which will be the Vue observer, and this is what Vue will be using. Because it will be in the same monorepo. So what we get is a state function that we can import, and this is basically Vue.observable, which allows us to create reactive objects. And then we also have a watch function which accepts 2 arguments. One is a function that which is there to figure out what the watcher is depending on. So everything touched within the function will be tracked as a dependency. In this case, it will be the counter value. And then we have the callback, which is what do we want to execute once the counter changes. And there is also something called value, a function, that we can import because with the state method, we are not able to track primitive values. It always has to be an object. But with the value property, we are able to create a pointer, a wrapper object, which has a value property, which contains the value that we pass, the primitive value that we pass. And it's a pointer, but not in like C++ sense. And it allows us to pass and keep like primitives as in reactive, keep the primitives reactive. So if we want to access them, we just do counter.value. And if we want to mutate the value, we just do counter.value and make some changes. And the same is with computer properties. So if you want to create a computer property, we just import computed, and we create it by passing like a getter function into it, which keeps track of every reactive property that was used inside, and returns a pointer similarly to the value method, which then can be used to with like watchers, for example. And in this case, if we are using a pointer, we can pass the pointer directly as the first argument to a watcher, so that whenever the pointer value changes, the watcher will be triggered. And why is this exciting, especially for me as an open source author? I imagine this would open so many new ways to create plugins. For example, Validate, because it has to create computed properties for each of our validation models. We are actually creating new component instances like on the fly, which might not be a very performant way to do it. It's all right, but in some cases it might be quite bad. And with the new API, it should make it possible to rewrite the whole library into something which is so much easier to work with. And then also it should open new ways to integrate or like build wrappers around other like SDKs or libraries, say React.js, for example, or maybe WebSockets. And then it should also make it possible to create easily like new state management libraries, and Vuex itself might end up being rewritten with the new API. The other nice thing is dynamic lifecycle hooks injection, which allows us to set up add lifecycle hooks and remove them dynamically for existing components, say in a conditional, for example. And it looks like this. So we can import functions that will be setting up those lifecycle hooks, and the names for the functions are name of the lifecycle hook prefixed with an on, like on-mounted, on-updated. And we can use them inside other lifecycle hooks in the data method, and so on. It will normally just inherit the instance, the component instance, where is it being called. And when we call the onUpdated, for example, we receive a function that we can then call to remove the lifecycle. So in this example, at the hook, the content of the hook will be only called once because it's being created. Then when the lifecycle hook is being triggered, it's being executed as in the callback inside. And at the end, it triggers the function that is just created when we created the when we set up the lifecycle hook. So there is also a way to pass a different instance, as in component instance. So this should allow us to probably set up listeners on lifecycle hooks on different components. And I'm not sure whether someone knew about this. Did you know you can actually do this already in Vue 2.6 or 2? I knew. Okay. So what you can do, because all the lifecycle hooks, when they are being triggered, they also emit on our component instance an event which is prefixed with hook colon and then the lifecycle hook event. And as you know, you can set up listeners with this on this $sign on, and remove them with this $sign off. And you can actually use this to listen to any event that you emit with $sign emit, which, as you know, you are using to communicate back with the parent. And knowing that, you can actually do this, which is listening to child components lifecycle hooks, which is kind of useful and not useful. There might be some cases, but I would, I mean, it's quite fun, but this relies on the private API, which might change at some point. So it's not that recommended to use. But in some cases, if you don't have used it, it might be just enough to solve your problem. And then when it's being removed, then yeah, you will have to refactor. So yeah. Okay, and knowing both of those features, there is something like advanced because we have the advanced reactivity API and dynamic lifecycle hook injection, we can create a new composition pattern. And I'm loving like component composition. So, but before we go into the new pattern, let's just very quickly explore existing patterns. There are mixins, higher order components, and scoped slots, also known as like renderless components, as in that's one of the use cases. But higher order components, I think they never like picked up in Vue, so let's just skip them entirely. And scoped slots, for those that have a React background, we use them to have something like render props, which is basically render props, actually. Okay, so mixins. We would like to have this functionality of being able to track the mouse position. So when using a mixin, who's been using mixins? Okay, so you already know, so I can just skip now. So we have a data, like it looks like a Vue component. It's basically the same structure, follows the same rules, except it doesn't. It can have its own mixins. So we have data where we set up the initial state. We have mounted and destroyed to set up and remove the global listener for the mouse move. And then we have an update method which just updates the state, and that's it. And then when we want to use the mixin, we just pass it to the mixins property, and it accepts an array of component-like objects, which is pretty fine. It's like very easy to use, and there are like no additional components instances. So that's pretty cool, but there are some drawbacks. First of all, imagine that your component also has an update method. And you haven't seen that the mixin also has an update method because you have like 5 mixins. And then your update method, for some reason, triggers whenever you try to move your mouse on the screen, right? So, and that's one of the biggest problems. It's all in the shared namespace, so it's very easy to basically override something. And if it's done, if you want to override it, that's fine, but if you do it by accident, then it might be very problematic. And it's also very unclear where the information is coming from, especially if it's like a global mixin or you have multiple mixins. So there is that. And then there are scoped slots, which in this case would be used as in to create renderless components. And it looks pretty much similar, as you can see. The only exception is that we have the render function, which in this case is just calling the content of the default slot and passing the local state as an X and Y. And then when we want to use it, we can use the with mouse renderless component. It doesn't render anything. It just takes the content that we passed inside, which has the template special tag, which is also invisible, like as in it doesn't render into anything. And then we can destructure whatever we passed here in the render function. In this case, it will be the mouse position coordinates. And then we can use it within the template. And this might seem very similar to the render props, because the template kind of works as the scope of the function, because we can't use those coordinates outside of the template. And that's one of the cons. So, but the pros, the benefits, is that it's a very clear where the variables are coming from. There are also no namespace issues here, because everything is like self-contained in the renderless component, and those components can be very easily like composed together, because the with mouse component can accept props, and you could have a different renderless component which gives you some information, passes it to a different renderless component which gives you more information back, and you can even rename the properties if that's needed. But the problem is that it creates a new component instance every time, and also the exposed variables or methods are only accessible within the template. So, new composition pattern. Is it hooks? Who thinks it's hooks? Okay, so, oh gosh. Okay, so it's not hooks. It's definitely not hooks, but it was inspired by hooks, and we call it composition functions. And composition functions look like this. And you might see that it's very similar, not that much to learn. So we import the state from the observer. We create our own local state under the mouse pose variable. We have an update method, which does the same as we did on our mixin and renderless component. And then we inject an dynamically unmounted and on destroyed, where we have the listeners on the window. And then at the end, we can return the mouse position. And when we want to use it, we just do something like this. So we import the composition function, and we can use it in the data, for example, or maybe in inside a lifecycle hook. So here we just receive the mouse position, distract it to just get the coordinates, and then return it within the data function, so that it's accessible in our basically everywhere in our component. So we kind of get all the benefits. Yeah, that's where it goes. So we get all the benefits from mixins and all the benefits from renderless functions with like none of the cons, because it's still very easy to use. We don't create new component instances. There are no new namespace issues because everything is scoped to the in the composition functions. function, and it's very clear where the information is coming from. So it's not like it just pops there out of nowhere. Okay, more press. It has React hooks like composability, because you can have composition functions inside composition functions, and so on and so on. But the differences are that it can be used in stateful components, and it's only called once because we have reactive state inside. We don't really have to execute them every time we do re-render. And also there are no constraints when it comes to the order in which you have to call the composition functions, where I think with hooks is that you should always have the same order when you call the hooks. So are you excited? Okay, good. That's kind of bad because it was all top secret. And could you just like watch for a short while here, this guy? Okay, I don't know what he's doing. Okay. Yeah, I'm just kidding. But nobody's laughing except this one person. So I guess either it worked or I'm just very bad at those stage jokes. Anyway, it's all on the RFCs, which stands for request for comment, and those are proposals. And because of those are proposals, it means it's all like might change, and my presentation could be thrown away like tomorrow or maybe today. I haven't checked if anything changed. So you can find them there. It's probably the best way to affect the how Vue 3 will be looking like in the not so far future, I hope. So join the discussion. If you have any feedback, we would like to get your feedback, get your ideas, and so on and so on. And yeah, everything that I presented might change, although I tried to pick only the one that changes that I believe are already quite stable. They already went through a lot of changes. So when will Vue 3 be ready? And that's probably the only question you really wanted me to answer. And I would just tell you when it's ready. Like, I don't know. But my guess is fourth quarter this year, but no promise. So thank you very much. And that's all I had prepared.
Wow, thank you very much indeed. We've got, I'm just about to trip over some wires, that would have been embarrassing. Right, we're going to read out some questions from our Slido. In your opinion, what advantages would one have with Vue 3 over React, for example?
Oh gosh, that's the worst question I could get. I mean, I very like React, although I'm not using it in production. I think now with hooks, it just differs a bit more where like both of those libraries are going, where React, I think, focuses more on like functional components with hooks right now. And Vue, because of the reactive state, is more on like creating stateful components. So I guess it can be a matter of preference. But I think Vue is better, but I'm biased, so.
React is making things more simple with hooks, a way to share logic. It feels like Vue 3 is making things much more complex. How do you feel about that?
Actually, I think with the composition functions are actually simpler than hooks. But that's also just my opinion. We'll see when it actually ships. But there is a small demo that I could show you. I will include it in the slides. So when you go to the slides, you will see how you can use like a prototype of those composition functions. And because I think they will be the best thing that comes with the new version of Vue, apart from the proxy-based reactivity.
Next, which syntax, class or object-based, do you recommend to people with very little Vue knowledge, and why?
Oh gosh, I'm actually a fan of object syntax because it's very clear where things are, as in methods. Here are the methods. Here are the computed properties. Here's the reactive state, and probably it might be easier to start with. Although it does include some magic, as in artificially binding this, but I believe that when you're just starting and you still have some gaps in JavaScript, the documentation is good enough that it will teach you how to build something, even if you don't know all the things, how the things are working underneath. So I think that's a very good start. But if you are coming from a more like object-oriented background, then probably classes will be the thing for you. Up to preference, I'd say.
How was the decision made to go full rewrite for 3.0? How much longer did it take than expected?
I think it might take a bit more than expected because we do the RFC. We have the RFC process, and there is so much valuable feedback there. Like we have like 50, 60 like comments on each of those, maybe not on each, but on some of those proposals. And there's a lot of like feedback coming from the community, and we try to take like everything into consideration. We are also working with, I think, every like large library author, like Vuetify, Quasar, and like some Nuxt.js, and everyone has a say in it. So because it's like community driven, because like there is no one big player behind it, it just takes more to consider every ins and out of every decision. But I think that there is a lot of progress. I think those proposals that I showed, I think they might be quite stable. There might be some changes, sure, but they already went through a lot of like bike shading. So that might be the biggest thing that impacts the changes. The tempo, yeah.
Is it completely runtime-less or completely pre-compiled build? Sorry, do you know what? I'm like a designer, so this is a little bit above my head. So you have to excuse me when I'm reading out these questions because I'm not really qualified. So bear with me. Let's start that again. It's a completely runtime-less, completely recompiled build a la Svet.js.
Okay.
Is it possible, or how likely is that to happen?
Well, Svelte. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Oh gosh, but it's an amazing project. Like I've seen a tweet that Rich Harris, I think that's the author, is like fighting the framework works of the future already with his framework. Like it's the next step. I don't think this will be coming to us like that soon, but we do, because we are having a compiler, for example, for the render functions, as in for the templates. We are already doing, and with the new version of Vue, we'll be doing even more optimizations when it comes to just like extracting some of like static trees of the template, just to basically provide even more speed compared to like hand-written render functions, which, because of the complexity of JavaScript, can be easily or statically analyzed and optimized. So maybe not to the degree that Svelte is doing, but I think we will be improving this aspect as in compiler-based optimizations.
This one from Lenny. What's the progress of time slicing in Vue.js?
Time slicing. Oh gosh, I don't know really. Like Evan wrote it, like I think in a few hours for Vue. It had some gotchas, so there might be some plans to introduce this at some point. But right now, I think the RFCs are the biggest focus when it comes to the core development.
I think we have one more. There might be another one coming in, but this is the last one for the moment. So we have hooks in React and Vue. When will we have them in Angular?
Oh, sorry, what we will have in Angular?
We have hooks in React and Vue. When will that happen in Angular?
Oh, we don't have hooks in Vue. I mean, there is a Vue hooks library, which is kind of like hooks for Vue. This is also something Evan, I think, wrote on a plane or something. And you can try it out, and it follows the same way of working as React hooks, but we ended up with creating or planning to use composition functions, because this aligns better with the philosophy behind Vue. And I don't know about Angular. Like I'm not keeping track what's happening there.
We've got another couple that's just come in. So this one, what happened to build in SSR?
It's one of the packages with the new architecture, and it will be built in as it is right now. As in, you have to import the server renderer to use it. But I think the SSR performance and so on is also getting better and better. Maybe not as we speak, unless they are actually working on it, because, they might be working already on it. So,
right, we're going to call this the last one. This is from Kay. Vue gives a lot of freedom to developer on how to use it. This can be great, but I only found mostly problematic. Will Vue ever become more opinionated?
I think if you want more opinions, you should know that there is a style guide, the official style guide. If you go to the website, it is under the top level menu. And there are a lot of opinions. A lot of them you can enforce with a preset for ESLint, for example. And then if you want even more opinions, you can use a framework like Nuxt.js, which already enforces some of the patterns. But then there are so many use cases for Vue. So if we end up being like too opinionated, people will try to like find ways around it. And we can only provide some like advices. I'm very, very much encourage you to read the docs like from the start to the end, really, because a lot of the stuff which is like unknown to many people, it's already there. Most of the talks are just like going through the docs and just presenting it, and the people are like, wow, we can do that. It's like it's in the docs.
Read the manual, basically.
Yeah. Kind of.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Everyone put your hands together.